Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Coalition to Stop CO2 Pipelines Thursday night organizing meeting. For those of you who are new to this, my name is Pam Richard, and I will serve as your facilitator this evening. Tonight, we've invited Julie Fosdick, landowner and farmer in Logan and Livingston counties, to speak with us about property rights and carbon sequestration. Julie's property in Logan County would be affected by Navigator's Vervain project. Over the last few years, Julie has learned a lot about carbon sequestration and the risks it brings to our health, our land, and our water. So let's begin by welcoming Julie.
I'm a landowner that was approached almost 4 years ago initially to sequester CO2 under our land. And at the time, there just wasn't any place to go for information about sequestration other than what the company was promoting. It was just really difficult to find anything. And so we've been really committed and continue to be committed to share information to other landowners so that they have full kind of information, risks and benefits, not just one-sided, in order to make decisions. So that's kind of our real purpose here, is for people to understand more about sequestration. So I'll start with the first slide here, and I want to talk about AOR. AOR stands for Area of Review, and this is required by the US EPA for a Class 6 well permit application to determine this area. This area is actually the entire pressure front boundary for an injection. When they put the CO2 down in the ground, in order to put CO2 there, they have to displace the saline that's already taking that space. So they have to displace the saline sideways, and that creates a pressure front, because you're putting that saline under additional pressure. And the boundaries of that pressure front are the AOR boundary that they calculate what they predict those boundaries to be. The picture is the Vervain project, which is where our land is. And you'll see it's a huge area. It completely encompasses the towns of Atlanta and McLean. So those two towns will have the Mount Simon sandstone under them pressurized. This goes beyond that, and it actually is about a 20-mile diameter, somewhat of a circle. And it encompasses about 200,000 acres. So you can see that these projects each affect a huge amount of land. This slide is a representation of what the geology in central Illinois looks like. The distances, the measurements of how far from the surface are for Decatur. These different formations are closer to the surface the farther north you get. So don't worry about the distances. What I really want you to look at are the different formations. On the very bottom is this Precambrian granite. That is a solid rock, okay? And it's not going anywhere. On top of that is a sandstone. That is sand glued together sort of loosely with the grains together, and there's a lot of space in between those pieces, and that's what a sandstone is. And then there's fluid called saline or brine that fills those spaces. I kind of like it to florist foam that you do for arrangements, because it's like a stiff styrofoam, but yet it will absorb water. There's spaces in there for water. So and then above that is the Eau Claire shale, which is supposed to be the capstone that would hold the CO2 down in that Mount Simon layer. Shale is thin, platy rocks, lots of little thin plates glued together with either oil or clay. This is probably clay mostly. but it's not a solid rock. It's pretty thick, and they seem confident that it will hold the CO2 down. Above that is the St. Peter sandstone, which is another layer of sandstone, but this is actually a drinking, considered a drinking water source. So we really don't want anything to move from that lower level up to this level. Above that are two more layers of shales, some other sandstone things. Very close to the top, you see that blue line, and that would be like the Muhammad Aquifer. That's where our shallow aquifers that most people use for their sources of water. So the way sequestration works is that CO2 would be pumped down that well that you see, and at the bottom where it has arrows, it would be forced out under a lot of pressure, because this is about 1.5 miles deep. And the saline or brine that's down there in that sandstone is under a lot of pressure. It's got 1.5 miles of earth sitting on top of it, okay? So they had to put a very large amount of pressure down to even force that CO2 out of that well. In order to have any place to put that CO2 down there, they have to push it out with enough pressure that it pushes that saline out of the way. It displaces that saline out to the side in order to make room for that CO2. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay, this first circle, we're going to say this is the total area impacted by storing CO2. This is called the AOR, or Area of Review. The US EPA requires an applicant for a well permit to calculate where that is, and that is the outermost pressure front that they anticipate when they put the most of the, when they get all this CO2 down there that they're planning to put down there. That's how far out that pressure front would be. And one of the significance of that they need them to calculate that is they have to look at all that area within that circle, which might not be a perfect circle, but in that circle to determine, are there any faults in the rock? Are there any places that are high risk of the CO2 escaping up through? They look at possibly that Eau Claire shale. Are there any real thin spots? They look also for deep wells where there's been oil or gas wells or something that have already, poked through that capstone. Outside of that, my understanding is that they don't really have to look around there. They just have to thoroughly examine that area called within the AOR. For the Vervain project, which is a Heartland Greenway project that Sue and our land is in, this total area within that AOR is about 200,000 acres. And when you look at that second circle, as you push the CO2 down there, and you have to push that saline out. So you're displacing saline, and the blue hashed area is actually storing excess saline. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. And again, you see this area of review. You see the blue slashed area is under increased pressure, and the estimated pressure front boundary. And in the center is the area where CO2 is actually stored. So only the landowners who store CO2 in this little circle in the middle where the plume of CO2 spreads to, only those landowners get compensation, basically. While the landowners in the rest of that AOR do not get compensated, and they do not have to consent for them to store saline under their property. that's just like, there's no law that says that they don't, but it's just something that nobody ever figured out. They just said, oh, we're going to do this. And the best I can figure, it's just, as long as nobody complains, I guess they figured they could get by with it.
So there's actually increased saline and increased pressure in all of that AOR under all these other landowners.
And as we looked at that beginning at the actual AOR map for Vervain, which that map was pulled directly from Vervain EPA Class 6 well application, that's under 2 towns. The pressure will be raised under 2 towns, and then 2 little villages, and then, you know, lots of other land. But it's an impact to a really large area. And an important thing there is that they don't even, not only do they not have to give consent, there's nothing in the law that requires them to even be notified that they're going to raise the pressure under their land.
And let me comment that the high school and grade school are also in this area.
So we can move to slide, the number 3 carbon sequestration slide. So there is approximately 16,000 acres in that CO2 storage area that might get compensated. Now, and that is less than 9% of the total AOR in the Vervain project. The new state law doesn't really, that I can see, doesn't spell out how they're going to determine the boundaries of what they have to get easements for and not. What would be the area that is going to store CO2 and has to be under easement? It doesn't really say. Is that the computer modeling boundary? Is that the computer model boundary plus some fudge factor? That's not really out that I can see. So more than 91% of the land has displaced saline storage. They're storing more saline than God put under there for them. And they are experiencing increased pressure, but they get no compensation and have given no consent. This, interestingly though, also this land that they have cannot be leased for CO2 storage once this project is in motion. Mm-hmm. Slide 4 of sequestration. EPA has stated that they would likely not approve projects with overlapping AORs. That's a huge impact area, and very few people would benefit or even consent. And Sue and I both separately talked to people at Region 5 EPA Class 6 well permit section, and they both told us that they would not likely approve projects that had overlapping AORs. Now that makes sense because they really don't understand what's going to happen and where the CO2 is going to go and how to figure that out. And so it would really complicate things if they had overlapping pressure fronts, okay? So they have said they would not likely approve any projects that overlapped. So there's a mistake on my graphic here. This should say green and blue slashed areas cannot lease their pore space because it has been hijacked by the sequestration company. In other words, if you approve one of these sequestrations, so the red area is having CO2 put down there, the people in the blue slashed area within that AOR cannot lease their pore space and have somebody else store CO2 under their property because it's already been hijacked. However, this whole process over the last few years has established that the pore space has a value, a financial value for storing CO2. So they are being denied their right to gain financial benefit from utilization of their pore space. It's just being hijacked. And then when you look at putting more projects next to each other, then there's still going to be space kind of between that's no man's land that can't get the financial gain from their property. So you see that you have a pretty small amount of land that gets to utilize their ownership rights, and you have a lot of acres that get denied their ownership rights. Next slide. People have kind of said, well, what do you think is going to happen when that CO2 is down there? Why is that an issue? And I just am throwing this in. This is something we just learned about in the last week. This is Lake Bomer in Texas. This was a well that was drilled into a saline, just like our Mount Simon is, only this is about half as deep. But it was drilled into there in search of oil, and it was a dry hole. They did not find any oil. Instead of plugging it and sealing it, they left it and changed the records on it and called it a water well. That seems to be what in Texas they do. And it has a lot of benefits to do that. But anyway, it was about 45 years after that was drilled that saline started coming up the well. Apparently the well corroded, and now there's a 60-acre lake there that is this saline water. Nothing can grow in it. It's a dead zone. I don't know how many acres around it are dead. And there's a battle over who will take responsibility to try to do anything about it. And there are more wells in that area that are similar circumstances that are starting to leak. One estimate thinks it would cost $50 million to plug that one well now. So I look at these are kinds of things that could happen under my property, and I find that quite concerning. Next slide, please. Okay, so what does the SAFE Act mean for landowners near a sequestration area? Well, it means that we would have forced participation within that sequestration zone if 75% of the acres within the zone are consenting. So if they can get 75% of the people to sign an easement, then we're forced. And as I said, that zone isn't well defined, so they very well could kind of fudge the boundaries around to get to that 75%. The effects of increased pressure in the pore space under the land has not been studied much, and hundreds of thousands of acres are going to be impacted by this increased pressure alone. The law includes protections for non-consenting landowners. This seems to assume that all consenting landowners had the needed information available to them to negotiate these protections in their contracts when they signed. And having been a landowner that was pushed hard to try to get to me to sign, I contend that the information was not readily available to the consenting landowners that currently have contracts. And I've been researching for over 3 years since then, and I've learned so much more. But when we tried to find information at that point, there really wasn't much available. There was the sales pitch, and otherwise there really wasn't much available, which is part of what has driven me all these months in my involvement, is that people have to have some information to make these decisions. So my next point is that non-consenting landowner protections include compensation, like the non-consenting landowners that are forced to participate have to get like the average of what the other people are getting, but that doesn't include bonuses, signing bonuses, and other incentives that were given to those landowners. They have to be given replacement water. If your water supply, your well is contaminated, you have to be given replacement water. And I think for drinking water, it's like within 24 hours and then going forward until it's resolved. And for like, if you have a farming operation, you have to have household water and you have to have even livestock water, and they have to provide that. They have a couple more days to get it to you for the other. And that's assuming, see, then that the people who signed those took care of getting that replacement water in their contracts, which I didn't think about that when, I was looking at those contracts. I wasn't near far enough around down the road to think about that. So it also provides for medical monitoring, that the company would have to pay for medical monitoring. And it says that they have to provide CO2 monitors to anybody that wants them. Also, here's a really bad piece of what they call landowner protections. A non-consenting landowner could have a residence as close as 200 feet from an injection well. And that is the standard for when they use eminent domain, essentially, and consolidate oil and gas and force people to participate. And so they put that same setback distance in these. So that's, that's frightening that you could not consent because you have a house close to where they want to put a well. And if they get 75%, they could force you to participate and they could have a well 200 feet from your house. So another issue is insurance, and we've talked about this before, that some of the insurance companies might refuse to cover CCS, and landowners could assume quite a risk load. So the new law does increase the post-injection monitoring to 30 years, but the example of a well in Texas that I showed you that at about 45 years out was corroded shows me that, the corrosion is going to happen over time. And, how long does this need to be monitored? Another thing I learned from these Texas wells is they said some of these wells might have to be plugged multiple times over the lifetime of the well. And a question I have, and I have some calls into some of these folks out there, is what's considered the lifetime of a well? Because you're not ever going to take it out. So, how long should they be monitored? And we know that the CO2 that's at the bottom of that well becomes inert in about 10,000 years. So how long should we be monitoring these wells? For sure, more than 10 years. For sure, more than 30 years, as far as I'm concerned. But, that's a huge endeavor to take on monitoring wells that long. So, Sue, if you have any other comments, that kind of concludes my comments.
Yeah, and I don't think I've got anything additional. It's one of those issues where if you're in the AOR, if you go to sell your house, do you have to tell someone, or does anyone even know that you're in the AOR and it may affect the pore space underneath you? We know that with satellite monitoring and injection, that the ground actually will move up a centimeter or two a year.
It's a millimeter, 1 to 2 millimeters.
Yeah. So this isn't something that's benign, that doesn't affect all the way up to the top. If it's affecting the top of the surface that much, what's happening down below? So there's still a lot of issues, as if the models aren't functioning correctly and the CO2 is not staying where it should be, what happens then? Do you just, it seems like right now, ADM just changed the AOR outline and went on. So there's still a lot of issues that are affecting people that don't have any say in any of this?
That's something I didn't elaborate on very much, but what we know, the wells done at Decatur did not stay in the area that was predicted where the CO2 plume would be. It moved quite a bit, and it's kind of tough for us to figure out where that is in relationship to the AOR because they've changed their AOR boundaries. But we know that there are 40 property owners that have filed a lawsuit against ADM because they didn't give any consent to have CO2 under their property, and they have CO2 under their property. But one of the things that I believe they were trying to accomplish with this new bill is it kind of says, yeah, that's okay. If it moves, they just become non-consenting landowners and they have to get paid. But the original industry bill said you can't sue them and all this. Well, they kind of took out some of that language, but it still basically allows it that if it, they get their permits and all, and then if it moves somewhere else, well, yeah, it's kind of okay. So there's just too much unknown and not regulated here. So,
Yeah.
Julie, point of clarification on 75% consenting or 75% before they can use eminent domain. Is you had 75% of acres, and then at one point you said people, and I'm wondering which it is, because if I were them, I'd be smart and I'd go to somebody who has the largest amount of acres.
It's 75% of the acres. I'm sorry, but it's 75% of the acres. And like in the One Earth had purchased land around their first well, and so that they got a lot of acres that way. They owned it themselves. And that could be, they could even choose their location by where they can get more land acres. But when you look at that 75%, then if you have people, if the plume moves and you gain some more non-consenting, well, now it's not anywhere near 75% consenting. Okay, it keeps decreasing. And then if you would really consider that all the rest of those people or all the rest of those acres in that AOR are non-consenting largely, they really aren't getting a very high consenting, but the law only requires the consenting within that sequestration zone.
Thank you, Julie, for an informative presentation tonight. We really do appreciate the time you spent with us. If anyone wants to get in touch with Julie, please email me at coalition@noillinoisco2pipelines.org, and I will connect you with Julie right away. Thank you all for another good discussion tonight, and to Julie for bringing such a provocative presentation to us. We look forward to seeing you all next week. Bye.